All right, guys, here we go with how a bill becomes a law. Start out with, you can see this chart here. It's in your book as well. We do know that with how a bill becomes a law, a bill can be introduced in either the House or the Senate, right? And it has to be introduced by a member of Congress. In the House, they put it in something called the hopper, which is like a little wooden box. And in the Senate, it's introduced. A senator has to get up and read the bill to introduce it. Now, the only thing that could change this, as we've discussed, is that a revenue bill or a bill that deals with taxation has to be introduced in the House first. And I'm not going to tell you why. You should be able to answer that question. Why does a revenue bill, a tax bill, have to start in the House first? So, in the House, let's just say a bill starts there, right? The Speaker of the House is going to assign the bill to a particular committee, right? Whatever the bill is dealing with. And then in that committee, they're going to assign it to a subcommittee. And in that subcommittee, that's where most of the work is going to be done, okay? It's going to be what we call marked up, a markup session, which is basically just amending the bill, okay? And all the amendments are voted on and so forth, okay? So then it goes from subcommittee back to the full committee, or they can also continue to amend it, and then the committee can vote to approve the bill and recommend it, and therefore it goes back to the full House, or it can vote not to recommend it, and it can basically kill it. Most bills die in committee, okay? Now, there's a special step in the House as opposed to the Senate. After a bill leaves its regular committee, it goes to what is known as the Rules Committee. And members of the Rules Committee are appointed by the Speaker of the House. So the Rules Committee sets up what the rules for debate on a bill can be. So how long people get to speak, can amendments be added to it, when does debate end? Set up very specific rules. And the reason being is because there's 435 members of the House, okay? So if everybody was allowed to speak as long as they wanted, nothing would ever get done. So there's a lot more strict guidelines, and the Rules Committee is what sets that up, okay? So it goes to the Rules Committee, then it goes to the full House, okay? If it's passed, then it goes to the Senate, okay? Now, the difference in the Senate, right, it goes to the committee, it goes to a subcommittee, same thing happens to it, is that on the full floor of the Senate, we can have a filibuster, okay? The minority party can basically force a vote for cloture, C-L-O-T-U-R-E, which requires 60 votes. So most bills then, unless there's bipartisan support, require 60 votes, okay? Now, where this doesn't work anymore is with judicial nominees in the Senate, okay? They've used the nuclear option, so now a basic majority, 51, can approve a judicial nominee, whether it's an appeals court, district court, or the Supreme Court, okay? But the minority party can use a filibuster to try to force a 60-vote majority instead of just your basic majority. Now, the bill passes in the Senate, and it's different than the bill that passed in the House. It goes to what we call as a conference committee, which are going to be composed of members of both the House and the Senate. It's their job to work out the differences in the bill and try to come up with a compromise. Okay? The bill has to be exactly the same. That compromise bill then is re-voted on in the House and the Senate, and then if they pass the new compromise bill, it goes to the president. The president can sign it, it becomes law. If the president vetoes it, it goes back to both the House and the Senate, and they have to override it with a 2/3 vote. This should sound a lot like checks and balances, because that's what it is. Now, the president can also do an odd thing that we call nothing, okay? Which we're all very good at doing, nothing. So here's what happens. If after 10 days the president has done nothing, the bill will become law if Congress is still in session. Okay, it becomes law without the president's signature. Basically, the president's saying, I don't agree with this bill, but I know that my veto will be overridden, but I'm not going to sign it. However, if Congress adjourns, they leave, they go home, they go back to their states, they go back to their districts, and the president has not done anything after 10 days, the bill dies. And we call this a pocket veto. Okay? It does not become law. Right? Basically, it doesn't give the president or Congress the opportunity, to override the presidential veto. Okay? All right. So there's the signing of a bill. All right. So the budget process. Okay? This is an important act here, the Congressional Budget Act of 1974. So this sets up basically limiting the amount of debate that can be done on budgetary items, okay, to try to make it easier to pass the budget. We're not going to go into the entire budget process and all the specific dates. You don't have to know that, okay? What's really important with the Congressional Budget Act is that two things. It creates the Congressional Budget Office, which is basically an agency within Congress that looks at the proposed budget from the president and what it'll cost, okay? And then it gives a report back to Congress. The Budget Act is actually, the other part of this Congressional Budget Act is called the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Act, okay? And that is very important because the Impoundment Act in this is that this actually took power away from the president, right? And Nixon was president at the time this was passed. So let's say the president doesn't want to spend money on something. So he has to ask Congress to rescind the spending for a particular agency or particular program. Because basically what Nixon was doing, he was telling his executive agencies, the bureaucracy, whatever, not to spend money that Congress had appropriated to be spent. And Congress's constitutional responsibility is to control spending. So basically the Impoundment Act of this Budget Act in 1974 told the president, you can't stop spending in a particular area just because you don't like it. If Congress has authorized it as part of the budget, they are to spend that money on that particular program or whatever it is, okay? And that you have to ask Congress to rescind that you don't want to spend the money on that, but Congress doesn't have to say yes to that request, okay? So if I ask you on a test, what act of Congress limited the presidential power in spending, and you would say the Congressional Budget Act or the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Act, okay? And I can re-explain this to you if anybody needs it individually, okay? So the Office of Management and Budget is kind of the same thing as the Congressional Budget Office. It operates, though, out of the executive branch. So all the different departments within the executive branch, okay, whether it's the Department of Defense, Education, Agriculture, whatever, they submit their budget proposals to the Office of Management and Budget, and then they put together the proposed budget that the president will then approve and send to Congress. Okay, so this works a little bit backwards from how a bill becomes a law. It's actually coming from the executive branch first, and then it goes to Congress, and Congress can make changes to it, and then it has to go back to the president for his approval. Okay, here's the thing. We haven't actually passed a regular budget since 1997. It's been over 20 years since the federal government has passed a new budget. So how do we keep spending money? Well, Congress, there's this thing called a continuing resolution, right? Which is basically a bill, if you want to call it that, that Congress agrees to continue to spend money that's already been spent, okay? And they may agree to increase it in certain areas, but this is why we run into this problem all the time of the government being shut down, because these continuing resolutions may only be for like a month or 2 months or 6 months, and then after 6 months they have to do another continuing resolution to continue to fund the government, because the president and Congress have not been able to get together and actually put together a brand new budget for the government. Okay, that's confusing, I know. Pork and programmatic requests. So we talked about pork, right? These were things that were put into bills. We call them a rider bill, that were added onto bills. Largely had nothing to do with the bill, often, just to get the bill passed. Okay, and this obviously kind of blew up the budget, blew up the deficit. You know, you got something in a bill about education, and in order to get somebody's vote, you put something in there about building a bridge in Alaska, right? That's pork, okay? It helped to get Congress people reelected. Now, basically, that's not allowed. What we have today are what we call programmatic request, which is similar, except when you add something into a bill, it has to be related to what that bill is about. Okay, so if we are going to have a bill about spending money on infrastructure, you could add a request in that bill that part of that money be spent on building a bridge in Alaska. Okay, because building a bridge is infrastructure. Okay, so it's really not quite the same thing as what pork was. Okay, there's a budgetary process. Again, you don't need to know all of these. Do be familiar, though, obviously, with the Appropriations Committee, right? Because they do deal with spending. That's the Spending Committee. And if you remember, I also told you the Ways and Means Committee is the one you also need to know that deals with anything that has taxes. All right. This is another important act when it comes to oversight. Remember, we talked about police patrols and fire alarms. It's the duty of the legislative branch to oversee the executive branch, right? And so they hold committee hearings where they bring people in to testify about, well, why did this happen in the Defense Department? What's going on? But right, their job as a check and balance is to oversee the president and the executive departments, the bureaucracy, that they're actually carrying out the laws properly. Okay. Another power, though, that reduced presidential power was the War Powers Resolution. Sometimes we call it the War Powers Act of 1974. Okay. Again, during the Nixon administration, kind of ironic, right? So the Vietnam War was coming to an end, and basically the president was committing troops to fight wars without congressional approval, right? We know that in Article 1, Section 8, it's the constitutional responsibility of Congress to declare war. So what the War Powers Resolution is that the president has to get congressional authority to commit troops for longer than 90 days. Okay, he can send troops. He can still commit them. Right. Sometimes the president has to act on their own and act quickly. However, he has to get approval within 90 days to stay there. If he does not get congressional approval, those troops have to come back. They basically have 30 days to be returned. Okay. So again, the War Powers Resolution or the War Powers Act reduces the military powers of the president and tries to kind of restore balance, constitutional balance between what is the role of the president as commander-in-chief, but then also the role of Congress in declaring war and maintaining the military and so forth. Okay, so the War Powers Resolution and the Congressional Budget Acts are very important when it comes to kind of trying to lessen the power of the president. Okay, we know that the Senate has to confirm presidential appointees. There is something that we call senatorial courtesy. This has to do with district court judges. We'll talk about this a little bit more with the judicial branch, but basically the president will ask senators from that state that have an opening for a court in their state, a federal court, who they would like to be on that court, okay? Even if they're a senator from a different party. And so that senator might recommend Joe Smith. You know, Joe Smith from my district or from my state would be really good to serve on this district court. Now, that's only for district courts. It's not for appellate courts or Supreme Court, right? Those are more powerful positions. Obviously, there's less of them, 13 appeals courts, 1 Supreme Court. So the president doesn't do senatorial courtesy in appointing those. But he will ask senators for district court nominees because there's hundreds of them, okay? Obviously, impeachment is another oversight function. The executive branch, actually judges can be impeached too. The House can vote for articles of impeachment, which is just a simple majority, okay? And then the trial's held in the Senate, okay? And a 2/3 vote to remove. If the president is on trial, the judge of an impeachment trial is the Supreme Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. If it's anybody else that's at an impeachment trial, the vice president or a judge or a member of the executive branch, the judge of the impeachment trial is the vice president, which makes sense. The vice president wouldn't be a judge in his own trial. But say a judge is or a member of the executive department. Again, the vice president being the president of the Senate makes sense that he would be the presiding judge in an impeachment trial. Okay. Again, unless it's the president or vice president, and then the judge in the impeachment trial is the Chief Justice. All right. A couple important terms here. You're going to see divided government and what can be the issues of divided government. Anytime that one of the houses of Congress are different, you have divided government. Or if Congress is controlled by a different party than the president. So currently, we have divided government, right? The House is controlled by the Democrats and the Senate is controlled by Republicans, and we have a Republican president. Before this last election, the Republicans controlled the House and Senate, and the president was Republican. We had a unified government, okay? Obviously, divided government requires more compromises, okay? But can obviously make it a lot more difficult to pass legislation than in a unified government, okay? All right, we've talked about constituent work, we've talked about casework, wedge issues, and I've talked about this, okay, where you have an issue that really probably could be solved, but both parties kind of continue to make it a wedge issue to show the differences between the parties, right? Whether it's immigration, whether it's gun control, whether it's abortion, right? It's kind of like you're on this side or you're on this side. I'm using my hands, you can't see me. To kind of create these differences for constituents to see what should my opinion be on this particular issue, all right? And wedge issues are largely, besides obviously the candidate themselves, wedge issues are going to be those issues that people will maybe base their vote on, right? I mean, if you're strongly pro-choice, that's a wedge issue for you. It's doubtful that you're going to vote for a Republican candidate. If you're pro-Second Amendment, and that's a wedge issue for you, it's doubtful that you're going to vote for a Democratic candidate, okay? And hopefully we know the term constituents, right? Those are the people that live in somebody's district, or if it's a senator, their entire state are their constituents, the people that vote, okay? All right, another important term here is log rolling, okay? This will be on the exam, it usually always is, but log rolling is, think of a log rolling downhill, okay? Where you basically agreed to support a colleague's bill in an effort that they will support your bill, and then so on and so forth. So it creates this log rolling effect downhill. I'll support your bill, you support mine, we'll keep this kind of momentum going, is what is known as log rolling, okay? The caucuses that exist in the House and Senate, we talked about the Republican, I think they call it their conference, and the Democrats call it the Democratic caucus. It's just when they meet separately as Republicans or Democrats, right, to conduct party business or to elect their leaders or to decide who's on what committee, okay? But there are also other caucuses that try to be unified in Congress, whether it's the Legislative Black Caucus or the Freedom Caucus, which is largely formed by the Tea Party, which is a more the very conservative arm of the Republican Party. Jim Jordan, who's your guys' representative, originally was the chairperson or the head of the Freedom Caucus, but he hasn't been that for a couple years, but he is still part of the Freedom Caucus. Okay. Interest groups, again, we'll get more into, we've already talked about interest groups, but this also, obviously, we've talked about the Iron Triangle, we've talked about, oh shoot, I forget the term, it's slipping my mind right now, but the idea of interest groups, members of Congress through committees, and then the federal bureaucracy, work in these relationships in certain areas, and they're mutually beneficial to each other, right? Whether it's the pharmaceutical companies working with the FDA, and then whatever subcommittee or committee that has to approve spending for the FDA, okay? Interest groups provide a lot of information for Congress. They testify in committee hearings when they're looking at a bill, okay? So you have an interest group like Greenpeace who comes in to talk about an environmental bill, or you have an interest group like the NRA that comes in and testifies and gives information about gun control laws, okay? So they're relied upon for that. They're also important because of political action committees. Remember that political action committees or PACs are part of the interest group that's allowed to give money to campaign. Okay, so this is where people believe there's obviously too much influence on interest groups because of these political action committees that can really fund a member of Congress's campaign, and then when the member of Congress is elected, people believe, well, they owe, loyalty to this interest group because they gave them money. Okay. All right, so we have, there are different groups that work for Congress, members of their staff. There are also committee staff members that do research, write bills. Okay. Congressional Research Service helps to write bills and put things in the right format and so forth. The GAO, the Government Accountability Office, makes sure that money that Congress has appropriated to be spent is being spent correctly. They're doing what an accountant does, right? If the Department of Defense is supposed to have 100 tanks, they better have 100 tanks. Okay? Government Accountability Office comes around and says, excuse me, you guys only have 99 tanks. You're supposed to have 100. What do you do with the other tank? And they're like, well, I lent it to my daughter for prom this weekend. Okay? So the Government Accountability Office makes sure that money is being spent correctly. And then I talked about the Congressional Budget Office, how they look over the president's budget and spending requests that come from the president, the executive branch, and give a report on how much it really will cost, what it will do to the deficit, and give that back to Congress. Okay? The other thing is the Library of Congress actually is out of Congress, and the Library of Congress is responsible for copyrights and overseeing all of that. And then you have like the Government Printing Office, or the Congressional Printing Office, which prints out all the government brochures and bills and budget and all that as well. The work as a support agency of Congress. Okay. Really don't need to talk about the Tenure of Office Act. Look it up. This is basically why Andrew Johnson was impeached, but not removed. This had to do with Congress tried to pass a law that said if you're going to remove a member from your cabinet, you have to have congressional approval. It was eventually ruled unconstitutional. Largely, though, Congress has continued to give more and more power to the president. It'll be interesting what happens with President Trump's national emergency in building the border wall or barrier, and basically trying to kind of reappropriate money that's been set aside for defense spending and so forth. And does he have the executive constitutional right to do that? If this $2 billion is supposed to be for this, and then he kind of redirects the money to be spent on this, it'll be interesting. I believe that a bill is being passed in the House, and I don't know if the Senate, I think the Senate is going to it as well, basically saying you can't do this, and then it's going to go to the president, and he'll probably veto it, but I don't know that there's enough votes to override his veto, and so therefore it's obviously, again, going to be challenged in the courts. And we're going to have probably the Supreme Court decide whether or not this is an executive power or if it oversteps constitutional norms, I guess. Okay, but overall, the power of the president has grown greatly. We know the power of judicial review, right? The Supreme Court can rule acts of Congress unconstitutional. Remember, though, the judicial branch is not part of the lawmaking process. Something has to become a law first, and then a case has to be made to go to the judiciary for them to rule something unconstitutional or constitutional. The Judiciary Act of 1789 is where Congress set up the basis of all the lower courts. It's Congress who establishes district courts and appellate courts and taxation courts and veterans courts and territorial courts. The only court that's set up by the Constitution itself is the Supreme Court. It took the Judiciary Act of 1789 for Congress to establish, or to begin to establish, the rest of the courts, and then they've just continued to add on since then. Okay. All right. Here's the thing: people do not trust Congress, and they have terrible approval ratings. If you look at this, here's the thing: there is this phenomenon that if you do an opinion poll on do you approve of what your congressman is doing, or congresswoman, or senator, I bet you Jim Jordan has very high approval ratings in this district. Okay, all of them do. But if you do opinion poll of the entire Congress, it's terrible, right? Often lower than the president, often. Okay, it's basically like, hey, my congressperson is fine. It's all those other idiots that are terrible. So their overall performance is always low. They don't get anything done. All they care about is themselves. They're just a bunch of rich white guys that blah, 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 whatever it is. But my congressperson is great. I love my congressperson. It's just the rest of them that are trash. It's a very common thing. All right? So I think that's it. Hopefully it's good for you guys and gives you some good information. Check out the other YouTube videos from Hit Pews or Crash Course, maybe for some further explanation or a different explanation on some of these topics. Take care.